Alright, this is David here. I thought I'd go over the different styles of winches and the different ways you can attach sprockets to them so you can power your equipment onto your mill. I'll start out with the standard utility winch, which is what I've been using the most on the mill, but I'm going to end up having to put some larger winches on things like the log turner. So let me zoom in here and I'll talk you through it of what I'm doing, and I'll actually go through and install a sprocket on this 5500. All right, on this standard utility winch, this one you see here is a 3,000 pound. They'll range anywhere from 1,500 pounds to 3,000. Most of the ones I put on were 2,000. If I had to do it over again, I'd probably buy a 3,000 pound for every one of them that I used. Originally, the reason I used what I did was the first ones I bought had a carbon steel spool on them, so I was able to cut this outside collar off and able to slip a sprocket on there and weld it straight to the hub of the spool. Unfortunately, those ran out rather quickly, and essentially all that's out there are these aluminum spools. And to put one on here, you'd still do the same thing. You cut off this outside flange on the hub, on the spool. You buy a hub style sprocket. Of course, this one's too small. I don't have one the right size to fit on here, but you buy a hub style sprocket. Easy way to do it, just take a pair of calipers, measure that, find out what size it is. Buy a sprocket with a sufficient hole size to be able to slip over that. And again, buy a split axle collar with a set screw in it, because you're going to end up taking a extended long set screw, like something like this one. Of course, this one's a little too large, but you're going to drill through the set screw hole into the spool so that this extended long screw will sit down inside of it. That will anchor off this sprocket, and it'll also anchor off this split collar. You're only going to weld one side of this split collar to the sprocket. Don't weld both sides. I guess you could weld both sides, but if you do, you're not going to be able to loosen off on this, and it's going to make it to where you can't pull that thing off if you needed to. I just welded one side. So all right, so that's relatively easy, pretty simple. You may have to alter one of the bars here. On some of these, I took it and I cut it on either side, run it out, welded a new bar on there that just jumps over. On some of them, I just cut a gap in it and left it. So it worked both ways. So depending on what you're doing with it, that's how you'd alter it. I will go ahead and insert a past video showing the installation of a sprocket on this style of winch, and after that we'll proceed with the rest of the video. Is I've already got a sprocket. It's got a 1 1/4 inch hole in it, which is what the hub on this is. So to be able to get this one on here in one piece, I just got to take this outer flange off. And that's not really going to hurt me as far as the land goes right here. I'm still going to have plenty left here for that to ride on that land. Alright, I got the bulk of it off. I just got to take off these little angles, little edges. Whatever you do, if you end up using a grinder to take it off, don't use a regular grinding wheel. This is aluminum. You got to get one specially made for aluminum. Otherwise, it'll load up a regular ferrous grinding wheel, and it can make that grinding wheel explode. So I'm just going to use a file because I don't have any handy. So I took a flapper wheel on a grinder and took out the ID a little bit, so this slips on here now. All I got to do now is go check the alignment with the other sprocket as to where I'm going to place it on the spool. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll put it all together. What you got to do is that split axle collar, you got to kind of rotate it where everything's going to line up where you can have a place to weld and not affect all your screws. But you have 2 set screws on the hub of the sprocket. So you can see one sprocket, one of the set screws there, another set screw there, and then there's a set screw for your split collar. It's not quite 180, but close. And then on the back side is where I'm going to tack weld that bottom piece of that split collar. Now when we start going to the larger winches, that's where you run into a problem. Again, aluminum spool. You got gearing on the outside of the spool, so you cannot alter the spool in any way, which means you're not going to be able to use a hub style sprocket. You're going to have to use a standard sprocket. This one right here, when you measure it, it's about 32 thousandths under 2 inches. So I just bought a sprocket with a 2-inch hole in it. That'll fit right on there very easily. Now if you'll notice, I've got this marked from trough to trough, and that'll take you across center. That's a 24 tooth. You always have to have an even number or it's not going to meet up right as far as being able to cut that across. Now of course when you're doing this and you're having to fit this using a split collar, an actual split collar like this, you got to make sure that you buy a sprocket that's going to fit on here and have enough room to weld. And needless to say, you're going to end up coming on the edges here and bevel it so that you can have a sufficient amount of weld. Do not bevel it alongside any of the screw holes. If you do, you'll distort the screw holes and you'll essentially ruin the collar. That's not too bad. When you go to fit all this up, needless to say, fitting it on the spool itself is rather hard. Even though you take the spool out, it's a lot easier to make you a piece, something like this. I just found something that was close. This is a PVC electrical conduit coupling, and I just took some emery cloth, took it down to where it's the same size as that spool hub, and when you fit the 2 pieces of the sprocket, to make sure you keep your gap properly, you'll end up wrapping it with this chain, and that'll keep that spacing where you need it. Of course, this will be clamped off to right there, and you'll be able to tack it up. Tack it only, because once you got it tacked up, fit it onto the spool itself and make sure it's going to still work, just in case you're off a little bit and if you need to make an adjustment. Once you get it, you see that it's right, weld it out, you're done. Alright, so not too hard on that one. Although a little challenging when you wrap the chain, just get you a piece of chain that's long enough. This one's a little short. When you wrap the chain on here, just get you a piece of chain that's long enough for whatever size sprocket you got so that you can sit here and clamp the 2 ends together. This to say, this is a Badland 3500 Harbor Freight. That one's also Harbor Freight. Now, the big difference is this 5500 has a carbon steel spool in it. So I am not going to have to use a split collar. I'm not going to have to use this larger sprocket. The bigger the sprocket is, the less torque you're going to have. The less, you're not going to have this 5,500 pounds of pull. Because that 5,500 pounds of pull is rated at the hub. So we want to make it as small as possible. This one is what, a 22, I think? Yep. So that's a 40-22, size 40 chain, 22 teeth. All I have to do is cut that in two and fit it on here, wrap the chain around it so I make sure I keep the gap and tack it on there. Once I get it tacked on there in the proper position, weld it out and I'm done. Gonna have to end up removing one of these bars, whichever way I turn this. This is gonna go on my log turner. I'll end up making a plate nut here and here, come out with a bar that comes out about 1 inch that gives me the spacing I need for the chain that comes out of here going to the log turner. So that's relatively simple. That's actually going to be pretty easy to do. So I'm going to go ahead and fit this one. I'll take this spool out of here, take this winch apart. I've got these little magnets here to make the fitting a little bit easier, and we'll get that done. And I'll go ahead and install this on the log turner. I'll probably have to put a new plate on the log turner, but that's not that big a deal. Alrighty, so I just took a couple of different hole saws, a 2 3/8 or 60 millimeter and a 2 5/16 or 59 millimeter. Really, this 2 5/16 should be a little bit small, but I went ahead and did a couple test holes, and you know how you usually have some play in the saw and actually in the hole saw itself. It actually ended up being large enough, the 2 5/16 being large enough to cut the hole in this gear, so that's the one I'm going to use. If I would have proceeded and used the 2 3/8, which is slightly bigger than what this measured out to be, I've been way larger than what I needed. So that's what we're going to do. But to be able to drill that and be able to center up the hole saw, I'm going to have to take a look on the how I'm going to do that. If I'm going to adequately be able to hold this in the vise or not. I would rather not have to weld a piece across here, but I have a feeling that hole saw is going to wander too much if I don't. So I think that's probably what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut me a coupon out and tack weld it on here so I'll be able to find center and then be able to use that hole saw, and that mandrel will keep that hole saw from wandering too much. Alrighty, to center this thing up, I'm going to drill it first with just a pilot bit. I figured out it's 0.875 inches or 875 thousandths between the inside edge of this 2-inch hole and the outside edge of this drill bit. I just went around here and checked it using coming all the way around, and of course did the front. And I'm right up against it all the way. So that's about as good a center as I can get on there. So I'm going to drill the pilot first. So now if I lose the center, I'm able to find it real easy because I've already got a hole in there. Alright, I need the 59 millimeter, which is this one right here. That is a little too fast. Let's try this again. I don't know if this is going to cut this. This sprocket is very hard. So I forgot to turn the camera on, but it was very slow going with this bimetal hole saw. Probably should have bought a carbide tipped one instead. I'm almost all the way through. I just got a little bit on that bottom side, but the hole saw is pretty much given up at this point. So I'm gonna have to wait for another saw. I don't know if you can see this, but I've actually drilled through deeper than what the thickness of the sprocket is. You can see that raised area right there next to the square plate that's welded on there. What's keeping me from coming through is I'm hitting the weld on either side of that square plate. So I'm gonna grind that weld off, and I may stick it back in here and just try to finish that cut. So I cut the plate off the back side. You can actually see an edge where I ground it and everything for about half of it, so it shouldn't take a whole lot to drill this through. it's hardened up that area, but the outside of this thing, oh, look at that. I don't know if you can see it, but you can see a ring, a hole all the way around some of that area. Alrighty, I don't know if you're really going to be able to see it or not, but I've got it marked with a soapstone there where I'm going to end up cutting it from the trough of the sprocket to the other trough, and that gives me relatively center. Doesn't have to be perfect, but close. I ended up just popping the ring out. I just had to give it a few whacks with a small chisel there where it wasn't cut all the way through, and it just pried right out. But left a little bit of edge, cleaned it up with a flapper wheel, and I took a measurement off of the hub, and you'll see it's just about perfect. There isn't probably maybe 2-3 thousandths at the most. So it's going to fit really nice. So that worked out real well. So I got it fit up on the top side. I'm going to tack one side at a time. I'm just going to have to be really careful I don't push this thing off when I tack it. I'm going to need to quit adjusting this and just tack it up. Alright, we're going to leave it right there. I think I'll bring the stick rod out here for tomorrow and weld the rest of it. Alright, I thought I'd show you the fit in here. It was kind of hard to see before on the other video, so here's a close-up. But one thing to remember from the very start is to use the anti-splatter, which I didn't use, so cleanup was a little bit harder on when I tacked this one up. But I sprayed everything now. But you can see how well this fits up against here. And when I fit the other half up to it, it's going to have just that little kerf gap that I cut in there with the bandsaw. And it's that way on both sides, that same gap. So I'll use the chain to space this, make sure the spacing's right, and that's going to work out really, really well. Now, you're not always going to be able to get that thing to fit up that well. Your hole may be a little large. So when you go to, if you need to put a shim underneath this to make this fit, wire comes in so many different sizes, whether it's electrical wire or just bare wire. You can always use pieces of wire coming across here, put onto a piece of tape, and use the tape to hold them in place. And you just set this right down on those pieces of wire coming down straight underneath here. All you need is like 3 places. And you'd be able to hold this exactly where you need it to be. So, alrighty. We're going to go ahead and hook up the welding machine and get this other one tacked on there, and then everything welded out. And then we're going to wrap it like so. I know I'm kind of blocking this, but use a pair of vice grips to get that. And that holds that chain tied around there. And we have just a little bit of a kerf opening on both sides, so you know it's fitted up properly now. I don't know if you're really going to be able to see that kerf opening. Yeah, you can barely see it there. So it's like that on both sides, and that chain just holds it right in place. Alright, let's weld this thing. so we got the sprocket welded on there. It's all lined up. The chain rolls around it with no problem. You just got a little bit of kerf gap right there, and then another one right on the other side. So exactly the way it should be. So go ahead and put this back together. Just take some light grease your face here on both sides. That will mate up with the seal right there. You just got to slide them back in on each end, and it's ready to go back together. All right, there it is. Now you got a sprocket on a Badland 5500 winch. This will go on the log turner, and so that'll be the next thing I do. I won't do that in this video, but that essentially shows you how to put a sprocket on this winch and some of the others. I hope this makes it easier for you to do that on your mill as well. Thank you for watching.